The year of our Lord, 1803, was drawing its final, frozen breath across the rolling hills of Gloucestershire. It was a year that had tasted of gunpowder and treaties, of whispers of war with Bonaparte's France, and the steadfast, quiet rule of a king who sometimes forgot his own name. But out on the lonely road to Westvale, the only monarch was the winter. It rained with an unforgiving silence, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of hooves on packed snow and the weary creak of carriage wheels. Inside, Captain Francis Ashworth felt the cold seep through the thick wool of his greatcoat. It was a different sort of cold from the damp chill of a military encampment. This was the cold of home, sharp, clean, and profoundly still. After months of the cacophony of the barracks and the sharp, metallic tang of duty, the silence was a balm. Yet it did little to soothe the weariness that had settled deep in his bones, a fatigue that had nothing to do with marching and everything to do with the weight of being his father's son. At 30, Francis wore the uniform of His Majesty's 10th Hussars, as if it were a second skin, the scarlet and gold a familiar burden. He had earned the medals, the rank, the respect of his men. He had done everything a duke's heir was meant to do, and still he felt as though he were chasing a shadow. The long, imposing shadow of Duke Felix Ashworth, a man carved from duty and granite. "Hold up, Jennings!" Francis called, his voice a low rumble in the confines of the carriage. The vehicle slowed to a halt. The steam from the horse's breath plumed in the air like ghostly banners in the fading twilight. "Everything all right, Captain?" The coachman's voice was muffled by the wind. "Fine. I'll just be a moment." The mundane need was a welcome excuse to stretch his legs. Stepping out onto the road, the icy air bit at his face. The world was painted in shades of blue and white, the skeletal arms of ancient oaks reaching for a bruised purple sky. He moved toward the line of trees bordering the road, his polished boots sinking into the snow. It was in the profound quiet that followed the jingle of the harness that he heard it. At first, it was so thin he thought it was the wind whistling through a hollow log. But it came again, a fragile, desperate sound that pierced the winter's stillness. It was a cry, the cry of an infant. He followed the sound into the shallow woods, his eyes scanning the deepening shadows. It led him to a low-hanging fir tree, its branches so laden with snow they drooped to the ground, creating a pitiful mockery of a shelter. There, huddled at its base, was a woman, her back curled against the trunk, trembling. In her arms, clutched to her chest, was the source of the cry. A small child. He approached slowly. "Ma'am?" The woman's head snapped up. Her face was a pale oval of shock, her eyes wide and dark, with a fear so profound it looked like a permanent part of her. She tried to shield the child, a useless, protective gesture that tore at him. The infant let out another wretched wail. Without a second thought, Francis shrugged out of his heavy, scarlet-lined army jacket. He knelt in the snow before her, extending the coat. "Here," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "for the child." She flinched, pulling back as if his kindness were a hot iron. "Please," she whispered, her voice a sound scraped raw by cold and fear. "We have nothing." "I want nothing from you," he assured her, his gaze steady. He carefully draped the thick wool over the whimpering child, tucking it around the small, shivering form. The baby's cries quieted almost instantly. "I mean you no harm. My carriage is on the road. I am taking you somewhere warm." Her eyes searched his, looking for the trap. She gave a weak, defeated shake of her head. I cannot walk." "You can," he said, the captain's authority returning to his tone. He held out his gloved hands, not for her, but for the bundle in her arms. "Give me the child. You will need your hands to stand." Her entire body tensed. But with a trembling that seemed to rack her entire frame, she loosened her desperate grip and allowed him to take the small, warm weight from her. He held the infant securely in the crook of one arm, then extended his free hand to her. "Now," he said quietly, "take my arm." Leaning on him, she managed to rise to her feet. With him supporting most of her weight, and the child held safely in his other arm, they made their slow, difficult way back to the road. It was not a sweeping, romantic rescue, but a grim, practical one. Jennings saw them emerge and immediately opened the carriage door. Francis helped her inside first. Once she was seated, he carefully passed the sleeping infant back into her arms. He climbed in after her. The small space suddenly filled with the scent of snow, damp wool, and a faint, almost forgotten trace of lavender. "To Westvale, Jennings," he ordered, "and be quick about it." The carriage lurched forward. The woman did not speak. Her head rested against the worn leather of the seat, her eyes closed. In the dim light, he could see the fine bones of her face, which spoke of good breeding, and on her left hand, a simple, thin gold wedding band. The questions burned in his mind. But a more pressing question took root as the grand silhouette of Westvale Hall appeared in the distance, its windows blazing with warm, golden light. What, in God's name, had he just brought to his father's door? The carriage rolled to a stop. The great oak doors swung open, spilling a river of light onto the snow. The butler, old Abernathy, stood there, his composure fracturing into visible shock. From a side hall, the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, appeared, her face a mixture of alarm and competence. "Captain Ashworth," Abernathy began, his voice strained. "We were not expecting—" "I'm aware," Francis cut him off, stepping over the threshold into the grand, marbled hall. His gaze found the housekeeper's. "Mrs. Gable, take her. She is frozen through." He carefully helped Juliet from the carriage and into the sturdy arms of the housekeeper and another maid. The woman moaned softly, but did not wake. The infant, still swaddled in Francis's heavy jacket, was passed to a younger maid. Francis stood back, the cold from the outside still clinging to him. His voice was sharp. "Abernathy, prepare a room in the east wing. Mrs. Gable, see to it she is warmed and fed, and send word to my mother." The maids scurried away, carrying the woman and her child up the grand staircase. Francis was left standing alone in the center of the hall. He had brought the storm inside, and now he could only stand and wait for the thunder to break. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the winter air, that it would begin with his father. The silence that followed the maid's departure was heavier than the one on the winter road. It was a weighted, watchful quiet, thick with the history of the house and the unyielding expectations of its master. Francis did not move. He stood as if on parade, his shoulders back, his jaw set, listening to the ticking of the grand clock in the hall. It counted down the seconds until the inevitable. He did not have to wait long. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed from the West Wing corridor, the Duke's private study. Francis turned to face them, his posture unchanged, a soldier bracing for impact. Duke Felix Ashworth was not a man who hurried. He moved with the gravity of a planet in its orbit, certain that the world would bend to his path. His hair was more silver than not, but his frame was as lean and hard as it had been 20 years prior. His eyes, a shade of blue so pale they seemed like chips of ice, assessed everything they saw for its worth, its utility, and its potential for disgrace. At this moment, they were fixed upon his son. "Francis." The Duke's voice was not loud, but it filled the hall. It was a voice of command, accustomed to absolute obedience. "Abernathy informed me of your arrival and your company." The way he said the words, arrival, company, turned them into accusations. "Father," Francis inclined his head, a gesture of respect that held a sliver of defiance. "You will explain," the Duke stated. It was not a request. "You will explain the meaning of this imprudence. There is a woman of unknown origins, a beggar by the look of her, being attended in my house. She was freezing to death on the road, she and her child," Francis said, his own voice low and steady. "I would not have left a dog to such a fate. I could hardly do less for a woman." The Duke's lip curled in a faint, dismissive sneer. "Your compassion is a commendable weakness in a soldier, Francis, but a fatal flaw in an heir. This house is not a parish poorhouse. The Ashworth name is not a refuge for strays. You have brought scandal under my roof." "I have brought a human being under your roof," Francis countered, his voice hardening. "Her name and her circumstances are unknown to me, but her suffering was not. Was I to ascertain her pedigree before offering her warmth?" "Yes," the Duke said, the single word as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "You were to give her a coin, direct her to the nearest village, and continue on your way. That is the way of the world, a way you seem determined to forget." He stepped closer, his icy gaze boring into his son. "She will be gone by morning. I will have Jennings take her to the village magistrate. Her welfare is their concern, not ours." Before Francis could form a reply, a third voice joined them, soft but resolute. "That will not be possible, my dear." Duchess Minerva Ashworth descended the grand staircase, her movements as graceful and unhurried as her husband's were severe. She was a handsome woman, her dark hair elegantly coiled, her eyes holding an intelligence and warmth that the Duke seemed to lack entirely. She smiled faintly at her son before turning her serene gaze to her husband. "Minerva," the Duke's tone softened by a fraction, but only a fraction. "This does not concern you. A woman and her infant child, freezing and starved under our roof, concerns me a great deal," she said gently. "I have just seen her. The poor creature is barely conscious. To move her in this state would be a cruelty I know you do not possess, Felix. What would the county say of the Duke of Westvale, who cast out a half-dead mother into a snowstorm?" She had aimed her words perfectly, bypassing his heart and striking directly at his pride and his public reputation. The Duke's jaw tightened. "Her presence here is a risk," he clipped. "And a Christian duty," Minerva replied smoothly. "She will remain until she is well enough to travel. It is a matter of basic humanity. Surely the Ashworth name can withstand a single act of charity." She did not wait for his answer, instead turning to Francis. "Your son has done a good and honorable thing, Felix. You should be proud." The Duke said nothing. He simply gave Francis one last, lingering look of profound disapproval before turning on his heel and retreating back to his study. The silence he left behind was a victory, however temporary. "Thank you, Mother," Francis said, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. Minerva's expression softened with affection. "He is a hard man, Francis, but not an evil one. Now, tell me what you know of her." "Almost nothing," he admitted, "only that she was left to die." Juliet awoke to a feeling she had not known in years. Warmth. A deep, bone-seeping warmth that came not just from the mountain of blankets piled upon her, but from a roaring fire crackling in a hearth of carved marble. For a moment, she was suspended in a dream, her mind refusing to connect this impossible comfort with the icy reality she had last known. Then, memory crashed down upon her. The snow, the biting wind, the despair. Rosanna. She sat bolt upright, a gasp tearing from her throat. The room swam before her eyes, a vast chamber hung with rich tapestries, the furniture dark and polished, a silver tray with a steaming bowl of broth on a nearby table. It was the room of a queen, and she was terrified. "Where is my daughter?" she cried out, her voice a raw croak. A young maid who had been sitting quietly by the fire shot to her feet. "She's safe, Mum. Perfectly safe." "I want to see her," Juliet insisted, trying to throw off the blankets. Her limbs felt heavy, useless. "Of course, Ma'am," the maid said kindly. "Mrs. Gable is just bringing her now." As if on cue, the door opened and the stout, no-nonsense housekeeper entered. In her arms was a small bundle. It was Rosanna, her face clean and pink, her eyes wide as she took in the new world. She was wrapped in a soft flannel blanket, a stark contrast to the threadbare rags she had worn before. Mrs. Gable placed the child into Juliet's outstretched arms. Juliet clutched her daughter to her chest, burying her face in the clean scent of her hair, tears of overwhelming relief streaming down her cheeks. Rosanna was warm. She was safe. She was alive. "She's been fed, Mum," the housekeeper said, her voice gruff but not unkind. "A bit of warmed milk and sugar. Took to it right away." "Thank you," Juliet whispered, the words inadequate, meaningless against the scale of the gift. She looked around the opulent room at the kind faces of the servants. Where are we?" "You are at Westvale Hall, Ma'am," Mrs. Gable replied, "the home of the Duke of Westvale." The title landed with the force of a physical blow. A duke. She was in the home of a duke. She, a disgraced wife, a penniless outcast. The soldier who had found her. He was not some passing gentleman. He was part of this. The kindness she had been shown suddenly felt precarious. A beautiful glass sculpture that the slightest misstep could shatter. The whispers had already begun downstairs. A stray. A woman of no name. The captain's charity. The duke's displeasure. The house was humming with the scandal, and she was its silent, sleeping center. Later, after she had managed a few spoonfuls of the broth, there was a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Gable opened it to reveal the man from the snow. He was no longer in his uniform, but in the fine, simple clothes of a gentleman. He looked taller, more imposing inside the house than he had out in the wilderness. "I only wished to see that our guest was recovering," he said, his voice quiet. He did not look at her directly, his gaze falling instead on the child sleeping in her arms. Juliet's heart hammered against her ribs. She was painfully aware of her tangled hair, of the borrowed nightgown, of the chasm of class and circumstance that separated them. We are well, sir," she managed to say. "Thanks to you." He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "My mother, the Duchess, will call on you in the morning." He paused, as if unsure what else to say. "You should rest." He turned and left as quietly as he had arrived. Juliet watched him go, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. She was safe for now. She was warm, but she was not welcome. She was an obligation, a problem brought home by a compassionate son into the house of a powerful father who wanted her gone. And she knew, with a certainty that was as cold as the snow she had just escaped, that her survival depended entirely on the man who could not even bring himself to meet her eyes. Morning arrived at Westvale Hall, not with a sudden burst of light, but with a slow grey dawn that filtered through the tall, mullioned windows, painting the room in soft shades of silver. For Juliet, sleep had been a shallow, restless thing, punctuated by the unfamiliar sounds of a grand house waking up, the distant chime of a clock, the soft tread of servants' shoes on polished wood, the muted clatter of porcelain from below. Every sound was a reminder of where she was, a foreign land of immense wealth and unspoken rules, a gilded cage whose door could be thrown open at any moment. She sat propped against a mountain of pillows, Rosanna sleeping peacefully beside her, a small, warm weight that was her only anchor in this strange world. She wore the same borrowed nightgown, feeling as out of place in its fine cambric as a sparrow in a peacock's nest. The whispers she had imagined the night before felt real now, seeping through the thick oak door, curling around her like smoke. The captain's stray, the woman from the snow. A gentle knock preceded the door opening. A maid entered with a tray bearing tea and toast, but it was the woman who followed her that commanded the room. Duchess Minerva Ashworth moved with an easy grace that belied the rigid formality of her world. Her smile was genuine, her eyes holding a keen, compassionate intelligence. "Good morning, my dear," she said, her voice warm as she dismissed the maid. "I trust you slept well, or as well as can be expected." She took a seat in the chair by the fire, her posture elegant but relaxed. "Your Grace," Juliet murmured, her voice barely audible. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a hot wave of shame and inadequacy. I do not know how to thank you." "There is no need for thanks," the Duchess said kindly. "My son did what any decent man would have done. Now you mustn't feel you are a burden. Your only duty is to rest and recover your strength, and to care for this little one." Her gaze softened as she looked at the sleeping Rosanna. "She is beautiful." Tears pricked at Juliet's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with simple, uncomplicated kindness. "Her name is Rosanna." "A lovely name," Minerva said. She did not press with questions, did not ask for a history or a justification. She simply sat, a calming presence, creating a small island of peace in Juliet's turbulent world. It was this gentle patience that finally unknotted something tight in Juliet's chest. "My name is Juliet Darnell," she offered, the words quiet but clear. "I am a widow. My husband passed recently. We were traveling to find my husband's distant relations near Tewkesbury, when the storm, it overcame us. It was a threadbare story, woven from half-truths to hide the raw, gaping wounds of her reality. Lord George Darnell had not so much passed as he had drunkenly fallen into a frozen river 2 weeks prior, leaving her with nothing but his debts and the scorn of his family. The journey was not one of hope, but of desperate flight." The Duchess simply nodded, her expression revealing nothing but empathy. A widow at such a young age. "You have endured a great deal, Mrs. Darnell." The door to the room swung open without the courtesy of a knock. Duke Felix Ashworth stood on the threshold, his presence sucking the warmth from the air. His cold eyes swept over the scene. His wife sitting comfortably with this stranger, the beggar woman looking far too settled in a guest bed of Westvale Hall. "Minerva," he said, his voice clipped. "A word." "I am occupied, Felix," she replied, her tone serene but with an underlying edge of steel. "I can see that," he retorted, stepping fully into the room. He ignored his wife and fixed his gaze on Juliet. "You have a name, I am told. Darnell. A name means little without a history, and yours, I suspect, is one you would rather not share." Juliet shrank back against the pillows, clutching Rosanna closer. The fragile peace was shattered. This was the man who held her fate in his hands, and his eyes held no mercy at all. "Father, that is enough." The voice came from the doorway, just behind the Duke. Francis stood there, no longer the hesitant visitor of the night before. His face was set, his gaze locked on his father. He had clearly been waiting in the hall, anticipating this very confrontation. The Duke turned slowly. "This is a private conversation." "It ceases to be private when you are intimidating a guest in my mother's care," Francis said, his voice level but unwavering. He stepped into the room, placing himself subtly between his father and Juliet's bed. "The woman is unwell. Your questions can wait until she has her strength. She is a guest in this house, and she will be treated as one." A tense silence filled the room. The air crackled with the unspoken history of a lifetime of paternal expectation and filial duty. Juliet watched, breathless. This was for her. This quiet, firm rebellion was happening because of her. She saw the flash of fury in the Duke's eyes, met with the resolute calm in his son's. It was the clash of an immovable object and an unstoppable force. The Duke's jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed he might unleash the full force of his ducal wrath. But Minerva was watching, her expression placid, but her eyes sharp. To lose his temper here, in front of his wife, his son, and this woman, would be a loss of control he could not abide. "Very well," he finally bit out, the words dripping with ice. He gave Juliet a look that promised this was far from over. "But her strength will return swiftly, I assure you. Do not mistake this house for a permanent sanctuary." With a final withering glare at his son, he turned and strode from the room. The tension slowly bled from the air. But a new, more complicated feeling took its place. Juliet looked at Francis, who still stood as if guarding the door. He had not rescued her with his carriage or his coat this time. He had rescued her with his voice, with his will. He had stood against his formidable father. For her, he finally turned, his gaze meeting hers for the first time without flinching. There was no awkwardness in it now, only a steady, reassuring resolve. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning to his mother. "I will see you downstairs, mother," he said, and then he was gone. Juliet was left with the Duchess, her heart hammering a strange new rhythm against her ribs. She was still a stranger, still a burden, but for the first time since she had been cast out into the snow, she felt something other than fear. It was a fragile, unfamiliar flicker of hope, and it was terrifying. The days that followed settled into a strange, suspended rhythm. Juliet was moved from the grand guest chamber to a smaller, simpler room in a quiet wing of the house, a room that was neither for family nor for servants, a comfortable sort of limbo. It was a clear, unspoken message. She was no longer a guest in crisis, but she was not yet anything else. Her strength returned slowly. She took her meals in her room, a courtesy arranged by the Duchess that spared her from the curious and sometimes hostile stares of the household staff. The whispers were a constant presence, a low hum just beyond her door. She would catch snippets as maids passed in the corridor. "The captain's woman, no family, no name. The Duke is furious." Each phrase was a small stone cast at the fragile glass of her composure. She learned to ignore them, focusing instead on Rosanna, whose gurgling laughs were the only truly honest sound in the house. Duchess Minerva was her sole visitor, arriving each morning with a book or a small pot of jam, her presence a shield against the rest of the house. She never pried into Juliet's past, speaking instead of poetry, of the gardens now sleeping under the snow, of London society with a wry, gentle wit. In these quiet conversations, Juliet's own intelligence and refined upbringing, so long buried under cruelty and fear, began to resurface. Minerva noticed it all. The thoughtful commentary on a line of verse, the quiet dignity in her posture, the innate grace with which she held her child. She saw the quality that lay beneath the worn-out dress, and the haunted look in her eyes. Francis, meanwhile, kept his distance. After his public defense of her, he retreated, becoming a near invisible presence. Juliet would sometimes see him from her window, a tall, solitary figure walking the grounds, his shoulders set against the winter wind. On rare occasions, their paths would cross in a long corridor. He would offer a stiff, formal nod, his eyes meeting hers for only a fleeting second before moving on, his expression unreadable. But she felt his gaze, even when she could not see him. It was a strange, unnerving awareness, a silent acknowledgement of the invisible thread that now connected them. He had pulled her from the snow, and in doing so, had tied his fate to hers in a way neither of them could comprehend. The delicate truce could not last. The Duke had allowed her to stay out of a grudging respect for his wife and his reputation, but his patience was a finite resource. Everyone in the house knew it. Juliet knew it most of all. Each morning she awoke with the gnawing fear that this would be the day she and Rosanna would be sent away. The solution came, as all solutions at Westvale seemed to, from the quiet, calculating mind of the Duchess. She arrived one morning with a letter in her hand and a thoughtful expression on her face. "My sister's children are due to arrive next week," she announced, her tone casual. "My 2 young nephews. Their parents are traveling to the continent, and Westvale is to be their home for the next few months." Juliet simply nodded, unsure of what this had to do with her. Minerva continued, folding the letter with deliberate care. "Their governess fell ill just last week. My sister is in a dreadful state, trying to find a replacement at such short notice." She paused, her intelligent eyes settling on Juliet. "The boys are spirited. They require a firm but gentle hand, and a woman of good breeding and education to oversee their lessons." A slow, dawning realization spread through Juliet. Her breath caught in her throat. "It is, of course, a temporary arrangement," the Duchess said, her voice still light, as if the idea had only just occurred to her. "But it would be a tremendous help to my sister. And to me, and it would give you a proper position in this house. A purpose. You would have your own small suite of rooms near the nursery. You would be compensated naturally." Juliet was speechless. It was more than charity. It was an offer of dignity, a role, a reason to exist within these hallowed walls, beyond being an object of pity or scorn. It was a lifeline, thrown from a ship she had never dreamed of boarding. "Your Grace," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. I have no experience as a governess." "You are a lady of education and a mother," Minerva countered gently. "You have more experience than you know. All I ask is that you consider it." Of course, there was nothing to consider. It was this, or the road. It was this, or the terrifying uncertainty of the world beyond Westvale's gates. "I would be honored, Your Grace," Juliet whispered, bowing her head to hide the tears that had sprung to her eyes. "I will do whatever I can to be worthy of your trust." Minerva smiled, a genuine, triumphant smile. "Excellent. I will inform the Duke that I have solved my sister's little crisis. He so dislikes family complications." Later that day, from his place in the library, Francis overheard his parents' conversation. He heard his mother explain the situation with the nephews, her tone one of mild inconvenience. He heard her propose the perfect logical solution she had just thought of, installing the unfortunate Mrs. Darnell as a temporary governess. "She is educated, she is gentle, and she is already here," Minerva reasoned smoothly. "It saves us the trouble of hiring a stranger. It is a most practical arrangement. Felix." Francis heard the long silence that followed, and he could perfectly picture his father's stern, calculating expression. The Duke was no fool. He knew his wife was managing him, but the logic was unassailable. To refuse would be to create a problem where his wife had already found a neat, tidy solution. "Temporary, you say?" The Duke's voice was gruff. "Of course, my dear," the Duchess cooed. "Just until my sister returns." There was another pause, and then a heavy, resigned sigh. "Very well. See to it. But I do not want her underfoot." Francis stayed hidden behind his bookshelf, a book held unread in his hands. His mother had done it. She had woven a cage of kindness and practicality around Juliet, securing her place in their home. It was a masterful, compassionate act of manipulation, and as he stood there, he was forced to confront the unsettling truth roiling within him. The immense, undeniable relief he felt was far stronger than what a man should feel for the welfare of a stranger he had pulled from the snow. With her appointment as governess, a fragile sense of order settled over Juliet's life. She was no longer an object of charity, but a functioning part of the great household machine. Her days, once spent in quiet confinement, were now filled with the chaotic energy of two boisterous young boys, Arthur and James. They were wild and high-spirited, but they were not cruel, and they responded to Juliet's gentle firmness with a grudging but growing affection. For the first time in years, she had a purpose that was not simply about survival. She had a role, a routine, and in the small schoolroom near the nursery, she had a kingdom. To Francis, this new arrangement was, on the surface, a perfect resolution. The problem of Mrs. Darnell had been neatly solved by his mother's ingenuity. He told himself that the persistent, low-level anxiety he'd felt had now eased because her position was secure. It was a logical, rational explanation, fitting for a man of military discipline. It was also a complete and utter lie. The truth was, her new role made everything worse. She was no longer a ghost confined to a sick room. She was a presence in the house. He would hear the distant sound of her reading to the boys, her clear, melodious voice a startling counterpoint to their rowdy interruptions. He would pass the open door of the schoolroom and catch a glimpse of her leaning over a slate, a stray curl escaping her neat bun, her expression one of intense, quiet concentration. He saw her not as a victim, but as a woman of substance and grace, and the sight would stop him in his tracks. His carefully maintained composure began to fray at the edges. One afternoon, he entered the main corridor from the west wing, his mind on a letter he needed to write, and nearly collided with her. She was carrying a stack of books, and his abrupt stop made her startle, the top volume sliding precariously. His hand shot out to steady the stack, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was fleeting, a spark of warmth through his glove, but it sent a jolt through his entire system. He snatched his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove. "My apologies, Mrs. Darnell," he said, his voice stiffer than he intended. "It is my fault, Captain," she murmured, her gaze lowered, a faint blush on her cheeks. She adjusted the books and gave him a small, trembling smile of thanks. "You are very kind." He opened his mouth to reply, to say something polite and meaningless, but his mind was a sudden, roaring blank. He was acutely aware of the scent of old paper and lavender, of the way the winter light from the window caught the soft curve of her neck. His words, when they finally came, stumbled out. The floors are quite solid," he said, and then immediately winced at the sheer idiocy of the statement. Juliet's smile faltered, replaced by a look of gentle confusion. She gave a slight curtsy and hurried on her way, leaving Francis standing alone in the corridor, his face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the roaring fires. He felt like a clumsy recruit on his first day of drills. The moments piled up, each one a small betrayal of his self-control. He found himself lingering in the library when he knew she brought the boys there for their history lesson. He would pretend to be absorbed in a newspaper, but he was listening, utterly captivated by the way she made a dusty old battle sound like a grand adventure. He caught himself watching her, his jaw tight, his focus so complete that a servant had to clear his throat twice to ask him a question. The young footman later remarked to the cook that the captain seemed to have lost his soldier's focus, a comment that, had Francis heard it, would have mortified him. He was losing a battle he hadn't even realized he was fighting. He told himself it was responsibility. He had brought her here. He was accountable for her welfare. This strange, consuming interest was merely an extension of that duty. Pity. It was pity. But one evening that carefully constructed lie was obliterated. He was descending the main staircase when he saw her below in the hall. She was speaking with a young footman, a handsome lad named Thomas, who was handing her a lantern for her walk to the nursery wing. Thomas said something, and Juliet laughed. It was not a small, polite smile. It was a genuine laugh, a sound of pure, unburdened amusement that lit up her entire face. It was the most beautiful sound Francis had ever heard. And as he watched the footman smile back at her, his expression open and admiring, a feeling shot through Francis that was hot, sharp, and ugly. It was a venomous, possessive sting that had nothing to do with pity and even less to do with duty. It was jealousy, raw and absolute. The force of it stopped him cold on the stairs. He gripped the polished banister, his knuckles white, his breath caught in his chest. In that instant, his denial was stripped away, leaving the terrifying truth exposed. He was not concerned for a stranger. He was not fulfilling an obligation. He was, with a certainty that threatened to undo him completely, beginning to fall for the woman he had found in the snow and in the house of Ashbourne, under the cold, watchful eyes of his father. That was a fall no one, least of all him, could possibly survive. The final bitter grip of winter began to lose its strength. Weeks bled into a month, and then another. The oppressive grey skies over Westvale Hall began, on occasion, to thin, allowing a pale, watery sunlight to touch the frost-covered grounds. The snow, once a thick, impenetrable blanket, receded from the stone walls of the house, revealing the first stubborn green shoots of snowdrops in the Duchess's garden. Time was passing, and with it the raw edges of Juliet's fear were slowly beginning to smooth. Her life, once a terrifying free-fall, had found a rhythm. The schoolroom was her sanctuary, a world of maps, books, and the boisterous but predictable chaos of the boys. Rosanna, thriving under the doting eye of the Duchess, now spent a cherished hour each afternoon in Minerva's private sitting room, a routine as fixed as the daily winding of the clocks. Juliet was no longer the frightened stray from the snow. She was Mrs. Darnell, the governess, a quiet but respected fixture in the household. This newfound peace allowed her to observe the perplexing orbit of Captain Francis Ashworth. His behavior, over the course of these months, had settled into a pattern of frustrating contradictions. It had become a dangerous habit, his afternoon walk, which now invariably took him past the long gallery windows that overlooked the gardens where she sometimes walked with the boys. She would feel his gaze from a distance, a focused intensity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up, only for him to disappear if she chanced to look his way. His attempts at conversation were rare and disastrous. When he found her one day arranging flowers in the drawing room, he tried for polite conversation and blurted, The table is quite agreeable," before wincing at his own absurdity. Another time, after weeks of near silence, he cornered her only to praise her very tidy handwriting. At first, his awkwardness had merely confused her, but after several weeks of these fumbled encounters, she began to see them for what they were, the clumsy maneuvers of a man utterly at war with himself. A small smile would touch her lips after he fled, not of mockery, but of a strange, shared understanding. She, who had learned to be invisible to survive, could see him so clearly. His composure was a uniform he wore, and beneath it was a man as uncertain as anyone. For Francis, the passing weeks were a slow, grinding torture. The logical, disciplined part of his mind, the captain, insisted this fascination with Mrs. Darnell was a temporary side effect of the rescue. But the man could no longer deny the truth. His carefully constructed defenses were crumbling with each passing day. Every glimpse of her gentle patience with his nephews, every distant echo of her laughter, was a fresh assault on his resolve. The breaking point came late one afternoon in March, nearly 3 months after her arrival. The air held the first, faint scent of damp earth and the promise of a thaw. Juliet was in the library alone, searching for a book of maps for the boys. She reached for a heavy atlas on a high shelf, her fingers just brushing the spine. A hand reached over her shoulder and easily pulled the volume down. She turned with a gasp. It was Francis. He hadn't fled this time. He stood so close she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. The air in the quiet library grew thick, charged not with the tension of a single moment, but with the accumulated weight of months of stolen glances and unspoken words. "Allow me, Mrs. Darnell," he said, his voice low and steady. He didn't step away. He held the heavy book in one hand, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Captain," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He looked from her eyes to the book, then back again. This was no longer an awkward, fumbled compliment. This was a confrontation. The silence stretched between them, filled with the 3 months of quiet observation, of nervous avoidance, of a connection that had grown in the shadows of Westvale Hall. He looked as if he were on the verge of saying something that would change everything, something that would tear through the suffocating layers of propriety that had kept them apart. And in his eyes, she saw the culmination of a long, quiet battle, a battle he was, at last, ready to lose. The moment in the library had changed everything. The charged silence between them had been broken, not by words, but by a shared acknowledgement. The pretense of their separate worlds, of captain and governess, could no longer hold. They were simply a man and a woman, caught in an impossible gravity. And so, they began to meet in secret. It was a dangerous, reckless thing to do, a folly that could ruin them both. But the need to connect was stronger than the fear. Their clandestine meetings were stolen moments in the quiet corners of Westvale Hall, a world away from the watchful eyes of the Duke and the prying whispers of the staff. They found solace in the vast, shadowed library long after the fires had been banked, the moonlight painting silver stripes across the spines of sleeping books. They met in the frost-covered gardens just before dawn, their words turning to mist in the cold air, their footprints the only evidence of their transgression. In the safety of these hidden spaces, the carefully constructed facades they presented to the world began to crumble. One night, surrounded by the leather-bound ghosts of the library, Francis confessed something he had never spoken aloud. "My father, he was a brilliant officer," he said, his gaze fixed on the dying embers in the hearth, "a hero of his campaigns. Every medal I have ever earned, every promotion, I have felt it was not my own achievement, but merely a pale imitation of his." He finally looked at her, his eyes shadowed with a lifetime of weight. "I have spent my entire life living in his shadow, terrified that the man I am is not enough. Sometimes I wonder, is this honor truly me? Or is it just a uniform I wear?" His vulnerability was a gift, an offering of trust that unlocked something in Juliet. She looked at this man, celebrated for his courage on the battlefield, and saw the fear he hid so well. And in his trust, she found the courage to offer her own broken truth. "My uncle sold me," she whispered, the words tasting like poison on her tongue. "I was a debt he needed to settle. He married me to Lord George Darnell, a man nearly 30 years my senior." She paused, her voice trembling as she dredged up the memories she had buried so deep. "He was not a kind man. For 6 years I learned to make myself small, to be invisible, to make silence my only shield. He wanted only one thing from me, an heir, a son to carry his name. Her voice broke. The next words scraped raw from her throat. When I gave him Rosanna, a daughter, he said I had failed in my only duty. That was the night he dragged us into the snow, for the crime of giving him a girl. The air between them was thick with their shared pain. His, the burden of expectation; hers, the trauma of erasure. He saw her then, not as Mrs. Darnell, the pitiable widow, but as Juliet, a survivor of a long and brutal war, fought within the walls of her own home. He moved closer. He did not try to kiss her. The moment was too sacred for that. Instead, he reached out and took her hands in his. "I wish," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that felt deeper than sorrow. "I wish you had never learned to be afraid." Tears she hadn't even realized were forming spilled down her cheeks. He released her hands and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a long, aching hug. It was not a hug of passion, but of comfort, of recognition. It was a silent promise, a shelter from the cold. When they finally parted, they knew their secret meetings had forged a bond that could not be broken. But a few days later, a dispatch rider arrived from London. A summons. Captain Francis Ashworth was being recalled to his regimental station. He was to leave within the week. Their stolen time was over, but as they met for a final, hurried goodbye in the shadows of the garden, they made a new vow. Their connection would not die in the silence. It would live on in secret, in folded letters tucked inside books and entrusted to loyal servants, every word a heartbeat, a promise to hold on until he could find his way back to her. The morning of Francis's departure was a model of aristocratic restraint. The air in the grand hall was thick with unspoken emotions, all carefully masked beneath a veneer of polite formality. The Duke stood ramrod straight, offering his son firm advice about the roads. The Duchess, her face a serene but pale mask, fussed with the collar of his greatcoat, her touch lingering for a fraction of a second, too long. Juliet stood near the top of the grand staircase with the boys, her proper place as the governess. She watched Francis bid his parents farewell, his movements crisp and military perfect. He did not look up at her. He could not. But just before he turned to leave, his eyes briefly met those of his mother. The Duchess gave him the faintest, almost imperceptible nod, and in that tiny gesture, a world of understanding passed between them. Then, her gaze flickered upward, just for a moment, to where Juliet stood. It was not a look of accusation, but one of quiet acknowledgement. "Be patient," it seemed to say. Then Francis was gone, the great oak doors closing behind him with a soft, final thud. The days that followed were a study in emptiness. A week later, a young footman named Charles, whose loyalty to the Duchess was absolute, pressed a thick, folded letter into Juliet's hand as she walked in the gardens. "From the captain, ma'am," he whispered, before vanishing. It was the first of many. Their letters became a secret lifeline, a quiet rebellion conducted through folded paper and sealed wax. He wrote of his duties, but mostly he wrote of Westvale, asking after the boys, after his mother, and in carefully coded phrases, after her. "The gardens here are not as they are at home," he wrote once. "There is no life in them." Juliet understood. Time, once a terrifying enemy, became a gentle friend. The seasons turned. The vibrant green of spring deepened into the lush, heavy green of early summer. The 6 months of Lady Caroline's grand tour passed. Juliet had created a true home for the boys in the schoolroom. They were happy, thriving, and well-mannered. Rosanna, adored by the Duchess, was now a bright, babbling toddler who had taken her first steps in the grand drawing room. Juliet's position felt so natural, so right that she almost allowed herself to forget it was temporary, until the letter came announcing Lady Caroline and her husband's imminent return. A cold dread settled in Juliet's stomach. Her time was ending. They arrived on a sun-drenched afternoon in June. Lady Caroline was a whirlwind of fashion and energy, her husband, the Earl, jovial and loud. Juliet stood with the boys in the hall, her heart a cold stone, her face composed. "Arthur! James!" Lady Caroline cried, opening her arms. The boys went to her, but with a strange hesitation. They hugged their mother politely, but their eyes kept darting back to Juliet, their hands quickly finding hers again as soon as they stepped back. They were happy to see their parents, but their anchor, their source of daily comfort and security, was the governess their mother had hired in a panic. Over the next few days, Lady Caroline watched, her initial surprise turning to quiet awe. She had left 2 wild, unruly boys. She returned to find 2 thoughtful, happy young gentlemen who spoke with respect and debated points of history with their governess over dinner. She saw the way they ran to Juliet with a scraped knee or a treasured discovery from the garden. She saw the profound, unshakable love they had for her. On the 3rd day, she sought out the Duke in his study, the Duchess at her side. "Your Grace," she began, her usual flippant tone gone, replaced by a serious, determined one. "We came to collect our sons, but I see now that we cannot." The Duke raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Indeed, to take them from Mrs. Darnell now would be an act of profound cruelty," Caroline stated plainly. "She is not just their governess. She is their mother in all the ways that matter day to day. I have never seen them so content, so secure. I insist that she remain in her position, permanently." The Duchess placed a hand on her husband's arm. "She is right, Felix. Look at what Juliet has brought to this house, to our family. Peace, happiness for those boys." The Duke was silent, trapped. He was a man who valued results, and the results were undeniable. His nephews were transformed. His wife and sister were united against him. To dismiss Juliet now would be to disrupt the very order he held so dear. For reasons that felt increasingly like nothing more than petty pride, he looked past them, out the window, to where Juliet was walking with the boys near the rose garden, Rosanna toddling happily at her side. She looked up, as if feeling his gaze, and for a moment their eyes met across the lawn. He saw not a stray, but a woman of quiet strength who had, against all odds, become indispensable. "Very well," he conceded, the words heavy with resignation. "She may stay." That evening, when Juliet received the news from a triumphant Duchess, she felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She was safe. Her home, and the home of her daughter, was secure. Her position had not been granted by pity or tragedy, but earned through merit and love. And in her next letter to Francis, she did not have to read between the lines to find hope. It was there, shining, in every word she wrote. The news of the captain's return arrived on a warm breeze in late August, a whisper that turned into a flurry of activity throughout Westvale Hall. For Juliet, the words were a drumbeat against her ribs, a rhythm of hope and terror that echoed in her ears for days. Her position was secure, her life with Rosanna and the boys was a gentle, ordered thing. But Francis's presence would shatter that peace. It would bring back the exhilarating, terrifying tension that had defined her spring. He arrived on a Thursday. The sun was a soft golden weight on the ancient stones of the house. The entire household assembled in the grand hall, the Duke and Duchess at the forefront. Juliet stood near the back with Arthur and James, her hands resting on their shoulders, her heart hammering against her stays. She was Mrs. Darnell, the governess, a respectable fixture. She had to remember that. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel outside, and the great doors swung open. He stood there for a moment, silhouetted against the bright afternoon. He seemed taller, leaner, the months of duty having sharpened the lines of his face. He entered the hall, his boots echoing on the marble, and formally greeted his father. He then embraced his mother, a moment of genuine warmth that made Juliet's own arms ache with the need to hold him. Finally, his gaze swept the room and found her. For a single, shattering second, his formal mask slipped, and she saw him, the man from the garden, the man from the letters. His eyes filled with a longing so intense it was a physical blow. But just as quickly, the mask was back. His gaze became polite, distant. "Mrs. Darnell," he said, his voice a low, formal greeting that was a betrayal of everything they had shared. He gave a stiff, formal nod. "I am pleased to see you are well." "Captain Ashworth," she replied, her own voice a stranger's, thin and breathless. She curtsied, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Welcome home." It was a perfect, agonizing performance. A stranger would have seen nothing more than the master's son politely acknowledging a member of his staff. But Juliet felt the Duchess's eyes on them, her gaze filled with a knowing, compassionate sadness. The rest of the day was a new and exquisite form of torture. At dinner, they were seated at opposite ends of the long, gleaming table, the distance between them a vast, uncrossable ocean. They were forced to make polite conversation with their neighbors, while every fiber of their being was attuned to the other. Every time he laughed at another's joke, every time she smiled at a comment from the Duke, it felt like a small, sharp betrayal. Sleep, Juliet knew, would be impossible. When the house had finally settled into a deep, quiet slumber, she slipped out of her room. She needed air. She needed the solace of the garden, their place. She found him there, standing by the stone bench, bathed in the cool, silver light of a crescent moon. It was as if he had been waiting. He turned as she approached, the crunch of her shoes on the gravel path, the only sound in the night. They stood in silence for a long moment. The months of separation, a heavy weight between them. The polite fiction of the day had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their connection. "Juliet," he finally breathed, her name a sound of pure relief. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped just before her, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He searched her eyes, his own turbulent with all the emotions he had kept locked away all day. "I have thought of nothing else," he whispered, his voice thick with a desperate sincerity. "Every day, every hour, only this." And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle, hesitant kiss. It was the desperate, crashing release of months of unspoken longing, of censored letters and stolen glances. It was the heat of his hands on her face, the soft scratch of his evening stubble, the taste of wine, and a longing that matched her own. It was a dam breaking, a fever taking hold. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, surrendering to the overwhelming certainty of it. This was not a mistake. It was an inevitability. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, resting their foreheads together. The world had shifted. The letters had been a promise. This was the seal. "Francis," she whispered against his lips, testing his name in the open for the first time. "I am not leaving you again," he murmured, his voice a low, fierce vow. He held her as if he could protect her from the entire world, but they both knew the truth. The world was about to come crashing down. Their secret was no longer just a matter of the heart. It had been given a voice, a touch, a body. And in the house of Ashbourne, it was an act of war. The world for a day felt remade. The morning after Francis's vow, the very air at Westvale Hall seemed charged with a secret energy. A stolen glance across the breakfast table held the memory of his hand covering hers, a silent, powerful promise that echoed louder than any spoken word. They moved in their separate, prescribed orbits, but they were no longer two lonely planets. They were bound by a secret, profound gravity that no one else could see. The illusion of peace was shattered by the Duchess over tea. "We must begin preparations for the annual summer ball," she announced, her tone light, but her eyes, when they met Juliet's, held a flicker of warning. "It is only a fortnight away, and it is to be the grandest we have hosted in years." Juliet's heart sank. A ball, a great public spectacle where the entire county would be watching, where every glance would be noted, every dance scrutinized. It was a stage, and she knew in her bones that they were about to be the unwilling players in a drama not of their own making. Her fears were confirmed 2 days later. At dinner, the Duke made a rare and formal announcement. "We will have a guest of honor for the ball," he said, his gaze fixed on his son. "A young lady I am sure you will all be delighted to welcome. Lady Estella Fairfax." A ripple of understanding went through the room. Lady Estella's name was well known. Her family was ancient, her fortune immense, and her beauty legendary. She was, as the whole world knew, the woman Duke Felix had long intended for his son to marry. Francis's face became a stony, unreadable mask, but Juliet felt the colour drain from her own. Lady Estella arrived a week before the ball, a vision of fashionable elegance and cool, calculated grace. She was beautiful, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She greeted Francis with a possessive familiarity, her hand lingering on his arm a moment too long. When she was introduced to Juliet, her eyes swept over her from head to toe, a swift, dismissive appraisal that was more insulting than any harsh word. "The governess," she said, her smile a perfect, bloodless curve. "How wonderful that the boys have someone to keep them occupied." Just as the tension in the house was becoming unbearable, the second carriage arrived. Lady Caroline and her husband, the Earl of Montford, swept in, bringing with them a wave of jovial, boisterous energy. The Earl, a handsome man with a charming smile, was introduced to Juliet. "Mrs. Darnell," he boomed, taking her hand. "My sister-in-law, the Duchess, has written of nothing but the miracle you have performed with our boys." He held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, in a gesture that was just slightly too familiar. "I can see now our praise was not nearly high enough." He smiled, but his eyes lingered on her with an unsettling possessiveness that made Juliet's skin crawl. She gently pulled her hand away, a knot of deep unease tightening in her stomach. Francis, standing nearby, was so focused on the threat of Lady Estella that he merely saw a friendly nobleman paying his respects. The house was now full, a beautiful, gilded cage crowded with predators. Lady Estella was the viper, her attacks subtle and social. The Earl was the wolf, his danger cloaked in charm. The night before the ball, the Duke summoned Francis to his study. The room was dark, smelling of old leather and disapproval. "I am not a blind man, Francis," the Duke began, his voice cold and clipped. "I see your distraction. I will not have this family's name tarnished by a foolish infatuation with a servant. She is not a servant, father, and she is not a fool's errand," Francis said, his voice level. "She is an obstacle," the Duke snapped, "and she will be removed if necessary. Your duty is clear. Lady Estella is your future. At the ball tomorrow night, you will behave as the heir to this dukedom. You will be attentive to her. You will open the dancing with her. And you will put an end to this spectacle. Do not force my hand. I promise you, It is a contest you will not win." The ultimatum hung in the air, as sharp and heavy as a guillotine's blade. Francis stood before his father, the weight of his name, his duty, and his love pressing down on him. He had known their vow was a declaration of war. He just hadn't realized the enemy had already amassed its armies inside his own home. The night of the Westvale summer ball arrived like a tidal wave of silk, music, and candlelight. From her rooms in the nursery wing, Juliet could hear the distant strains of the orchestra tuning their instruments and the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. She dressed the boys in their miniature formal jackets, their excitement a stark contrast to the hollow ache in her own chest. For her, the ball was not a celebration. It was a battlefield she was forbidden to enter, a place where the man she loved was being presented to the woman he was supposed to marry, just as she was preparing for a long, quiet evening with a book. A soft knock came at her door. It was the Duchess, her face a mask of serene urgency. "Juliet, my dear," Minerva began, stepping into the room, "I find myself in a dreadful predicament, and you are the only one who can help me." "Of course, Your Grace," Juliet said, confused. "My personal maid has a terrible migraine, and the clasp on my pearl necklace, the one the Duke insists I wear, is broken. I cannot possibly fix it myself." She took Juliet's hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Please, you must come to my chambers and assist me. There is no one else I can trust." It was a pretext, Juliet knew, but one she could not refuse. She followed the Duchess to her opulent dressing room, a glittering world of perfume bottles and jewel boxes. Laid out on the bed was not a necklace, but a gown. It was a dress of the deepest midnight blue silk, simple in its cut but exquisitely made, with tiny seed pearls shimmering like captured starlight at the neckline and sleeves. "Your Grace," Juliet breathed, her eyes wide. "This is a gown I had made that, sadly, does not suit my complexion in the candlelight," Minerva said, with a dismissive wave of her hand. It was a blatant, beautiful lie. The dress was made for someone younger, for someone with Juliet's exact height and figure. It would be a shame for it to go unworn. "Help an old woman with her vanity, my dear. Put it on. Just for a moment, so I might see it as it was intended." Before Juliet could protest, the Duchess was helping her out of her simple governess dress and into the cool, whispering silk. It fit as if it were a second skin. When she stood before the mirror, she did not recognize the woman staring back. The severe bun was gone, her hair now styled in a soft, elegant twist at the nape of her neck, a style Minerva's maid had clearly been instructed to show her. She was not Mrs. Darnell. She was a vision. "Perfect," Minerva whispered, her eyes shining with triumph. She then held up a simple pearl necklace. "Now, for my little deception. The boys are to be allowed to watch the first dance from the upstairs gallery. Their governess must, of course, be there to supervise them. It is your duty, after all." The plan was audacious, brilliant, and terrifying. Juliet was not to be a guest. She was to be an invisible presence, hidden in plain sight. Leaning on the Duchess's arm, Juliet was escorted not to the gallery, but to a quiet alcove just off the main ballroom. The heat, the light, the roar of 100 conversations washed over her. It was a world of shimmering jewels and flawless smiles, and she felt like a fraud. Then she saw him. Francis stood near the dance floor, trapped in a conversation with Lady Estella, his face a perfect, handsome mask of polite boredom. The Duke was nearby, watching them, his expression one of grim satisfaction. As the orchestra master called for the first dance, Francis turned to Estella, his duty clear. But at that exact moment, his eyes scanned the crowd and found Juliet in the alcove. The world stopped. The music, the chatter, the rustle of gowns, it all faded into a dull roar in his ears. There was only her. He saw the terror in her eyes, the midnight blue of her dress, the impossible, breathtaking reality of her presence. His father's ultimatum, his duty, his name. It all turned to ash. He had made a vow in a quiet nursery, and he would not break it in a crowded ballroom. Ignoring Lady Estella's outstretched hand, ignoring his father's thunderous glare, Francis walked away from them. He crossed the floor, his path direct and unwavering, the crowd parting before him. He stopped in front of Juliet, his eyes burning with a fierce, possessive love. "You are here," he breathed, as if she were a miracle. He held out his hand. "Dance with me." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Taking his hand, Juliet allowed him to lead her to the center of the floor as the orchestra began the waltz. They were the only couple dancing. Every eye in the county was upon them. "Everyone is staring," Juliet whispered, her body trembling in his arms. He pulled her closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Let them stare," he murmured, his voice a low, comforting rumble meant only for her. "Only see me, Juliet. Forget the eyes around you. They stare not with judgment, but because they envy the starlight you have brought into this room." In his arms, the fear began to melt away, replaced by a dizzying, defiant joy. For the length of one song, they were not a captain and a governess. They were just a man and a woman, their love a silent, blazing declaration in the center of a silent, watching world. When the music ended, the spell was broken. Francis escorted her from the floor and was immediately intercepted by his furious father. Seizing her chance, Lady Estella cornered Juliet near the terrace doors. "You have made a grave mistake," Estella hissed, her beautiful face a mask of cold fury. "You may have the captain's pity for now, but a mongrel in silk is still a mongrel. You will never be one of us." Before Juliet could even form a reply, Francis was there, his expression like ice. He stepped between them, shielding Juliet with his body. "You will address Mrs. Darnell with respect, Estella," he said, his voice quiet but lethal, "or you will not address her at all. Her grace and character are worth more than your entire bloodline. Now, if you will excuse us." He took Juliet's arm and led her away, leaving a humiliated Lady Estella trembling with rage. The triumph, however, was short-lived. Later, as Juliet tried to slip back to the safety of the nursery, a hand closed on her arm in a shadowed corridor. It was the Earl of Montfort. "A stunning performance, Mrs. Darnell," he said, his charming smile not reaching his possessive eyes. He had been drinking. "You have the captain dancing to your tune. But a man like that, he tires of his toys." He leaned closer, his voice a low, menacing purr. "When he does, you will find that other men appreciate a woman of your hidden talents. Do not forget that." He released her arm and melted back into the party, leaving Juliet cold with a new and terrifying fear. She had won a public victory, but in doing so, she had enraged not one, but two dangerous enemies. The aftermath of the ball was a quiet, undeclared war. Lady Estella departed the next morning, her face a mask of cold fury, leaving behind a scandal that buzzed through the county's drawing rooms for weeks. The Duke was a thundercloud of silent rage, speaking to his son only when absolutely necessary, his disapproval a suffocating presence. But Francis and Juliet, united in their defiance, found strength in the shared secret. They were no longer hiding their affection, but they were not yet free to show it. Every polite exchange in front of the family was a performance, their real conversation taking place in long, smouldering glances across the room. The Earl of Montfort remained, his jovial mask firmly in place. But Juliet felt his eyes on her constantly. It was a watchful, predatory gaze that made her shiver, a silent threat that Francis, consumed by the battle with his father, failed to notice. The trap was sprung a few nights later. The Duchess and her sister, Lady Caroline, were called away to a neighbouring estate to sit with a sick friend. The Earl, complaining of a sudden and violent headache, begged off, staying behind. An hour after the women had departed, a young maid knocked on Juliet's door. "Mrs. Darnell," the girl said nervously. "His lordship, the Earl, is in some distress. He asks if you might have a remedy, a calming tincture perhaps for his head." The request was plausible. As the governess, she kept a small chest of common remedies for the boys. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach, but to refuse such a simple, charitable request would be an insult. With a sense of deep foreboding, she retrieved a small bottle of lavender water and made her way to the Earl's private sitting room. She found him standing by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. There was no sign of illness in his face, only a triumphant, predatory gleam in his eyes. He closed the door softly behind her, the click of the latch echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "Thank you for coming, Juliet," he said, his voice a low purr. He did not call her Mrs. Darnell. "I have found myself quite taken with you since my return. You have a fire in you. I saw it at the ball." Juliet backed away, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "My lord, you are mistaken. I came only to offer a remedy for your headache." He laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. He blocked her path to the door, his large frame an impassable wall. "Oh, I don't think so. My headache is quite gone, but I find I have another appetite. You will come to my bed tonight." "Never!" she gasped, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. "Do not be a fool," he hissed, his charming face twisting into an ugly snarl. "If you refuse, if you speak a single word of this, I will simply tell them you threw yourself at me. A penniless governess trying to entrap an earl. Who will they believe? They will have you on the road before dawn, disgraced and ruined. Your captain will not want you then, will he?" At that exact moment, Francis was walking the corridor. Seeing the light still on in his uncle's rooms, he decided to check on the man's supposed illness. He approached the door, which was ajar by a mere fraction of an inch, just enough to see within. He did not hear the words. He only saw the scene. He saw the Earl with his back to the door, blocking Juliet's escape. He saw the man's hand on her arm, and his other hand coming up to touch her face, a gesture of leering ownership. He saw Juliet, frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide, with what he, in a blinding flash of agony, misinterpreted as shocked complicity. The world bleached of all colour. The vow he had made in the nursery, his hand covering hers over the sleeping child, turned to ash in his mouth. Her breath is my breath. Her safety is my honour. Her heart is my home. The words mocked him, a fool's promise to a woman who now stood in the intimate grasp of another man. A dagger of pure, absolute betrayal plunged into his heart, stealing his breath, his reason, his soul. He did not make a sound. He did not burst in. The soldier's discipline took over, a cold, empty shell encasing the screaming ruin within. He turned on his heel, his movements silent and precise, and walked away. Juliet, in that moment, shoved the Earl away with all her strength. "Do not touch me!" she cried, and fled the room, running back to the safety of the nursery, her body trembling with revulsion and fear. She found no comfort there. She was alone, trapped in a house, with a man who was threatening her, and the man who had sworn to be her salvation had just seen a lie that would destroy them both. Juliet spent the night in a state of waking terror, starting at every creak of the floorboards, imagining the Earl's leering face in every shadow. Sleep was an impossibility. Her world, which had felt so full of promise just days before, had shrunk to a single desperate need. Find Francis. She needed to feel his arms around her, to hear his voice, promise her safety. She needed to tell him everything. She found him the next morning in the library, staring out the window at the rain-swept gardens. A profound relief washed over her, so powerful it made her weak. "Francis," she began, her voice a trembling whisper as she closed the door behind her. He did not turn. His entire body was a rigid line of tension. "You should be with the children, Mrs. Darnell," he said, his voice flat and cold, utterly devoid of the warmth she clung to. "That is your duty, is it not?" The name landed with a brutal, stunning force. Mrs. Darnell. He had not called her that in months, not since their first hesitant days. It was a name for a stranger, a servant. She took a faltering step forward. "Francis, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Last night, the Earl—" "I'm not interested in the Earl's affairs," he cut her off, finally turning to face her. The man who looked at her was not the man from the nursery. The tenderness in his eyes had been replaced by a frozen, blue fire. He was a fortress of ice. Every word was a perfectly shaped shard, designed to cut. "And I am not interested in yours. Perform your duties. That is all I, or this family, require of you." He strode past her and left the room without another glance, leaving her standing in the suffocating silence. The 4 words, "I am not interested," echoing in the space where her heart had been. The days that followed were a descent into hell. Francis was a ghost to her, his presence a constant aching void. At meals his gaze passed straight through her, as if she were made of glass. If they passed in a corridor, he would give a stiff, formal nod and quicken his pace. The coldness was a relentless, soul-crushing torment. Worse, the Earl saw it all. He watched her misery with a smug, satisfied smirk, knowing she was utterly alone, his threat hanging over her like a headsman's axe. For Francis, it was a different kind of agony. His heart was at war with his eyes. He replayed the scene he had witnessed 1,000 times. The image of Juliet in the Earl's grasp burned into his mind. But it made no sense. He began to watch them, not with the eyes of a lover, but with the cold, analytical mind of a soldier. He saw the way Juliet flinched whenever the Earl entered a room. He saw the genuine terror in her eyes when the man's voice boomed across the drawing room. This was not the behavior of a co-conspirator. It was the behavior of prey. A sliver of doubt, sharp and painful, lodged itself in his heart. A few days later, his doubt led him to the gardens. He saw the Earl follow Juliet into a secluded rose alcove, and a cold premonition seized him. Concealing himself behind a thick hedge, he moved closer, close enough to hear. "You've been avoiding me," the Earl snarled, grabbing Juliet's arm. "That was a mistake. We will finish our conversation tonight." "Leave me be," Juliet cried, her voice laced with desperate courage as she struggled to free herself. "I will tell the Duchess. I will tell your wife." The Earl laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Tell her. And I will paint you as a whore who tried to seduce me to gain a foothold in this family. You'll be ruined, disgraced. Do you think for 1 second they will believe you over me?" The truth descended on Francis, a stunning, suffocating weight. The betrayal he had felt was his own. A betrayal of her, of his vow, of the love he had sworn was his home. A surge of white-hot fury, pure and absolute, obliterated everything else. He exploded from his hiding place. Before the Earl could even turn, Francis was on him, a blur of righteous violence. He grabbed the man by the collar of his fine jacket, spun him around, and delivered a single, powerful punch to the jaw. The sound was a sickening crack. The Earl crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Francis stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving, his knuckles raw. The rage drained away as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a vast, hollow ache of shame. He turned to Juliet. She was pressed against the stone wall, her face ashen, her eyes wide with terror. He rushed to her, his own face a mask of profound regret. He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently take her by the shoulders, his touch infinitely tender. "Juliet," he said, his voice breaking, shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Forgive me. I am a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I saw, but I didn't understand." He looked into her eyes, his soul bare. "I should have trusted you. I will never, ever doubt you again." The sound of shouting from the main house signaled that the commotion had been seen. Footmen were running toward them. The Earl began to stir on the ground with a low moan. The private reckoning was over. The public one, Francis knew, was about to begin. And as he stood there, shielding Juliet with his own body, he felt the first faint tremor of his father's approaching earthquake. The 2 footmen skidded to a halt on the manicured lawn, their eyes wide with horror at the scene before them. The Earl of Montford unconscious, the captain standing over him like a vengeful god, and the governess, pale and trembling against the wall. Before they could even form a thought, a new presence commanded the scene. The Duke strode onto the terrace, not running, but moving with a deliberate, powerful pace that promised retribution. His eyes took in everything in a single, sweeping glance. His son's fury, the Earl's prone form, the terrified governess, the gaping servants. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His first priority was not justice. It was silence. "You two," he snapped at the footman, his voice a low, dangerous command. "Get him inside. Use the south entrance. See that he is taken to his rooms. Not a word to anyone. Is that understood?" The men, grateful for a direct order, nodded mutely and hurried to lift the groaning Earl, half carrying, half dragging him away from prying eyes. Just then, the Duchess arrived, her face pale but her expression resolute. Her gaze went straight to Juliet. She glided past her husband and son, her movements a study in calm efficiency. "Come with me, my dear," she said to Juliet, her voice a firm, comforting whisper. She took Juliet's arm, shielding her from the Duke's glare. "Mrs. Gable will see to you. You are not to speak of this to anyone." She guided a trembling Juliet toward the house, a silent promise of protection in her touch. The Duke waited until the women were gone. He turned to the 2 footmen who were now returning from their task. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice dropping to a level that was more menacing than any shout. "You saw nothing. You heard nothing. The Earl had too much wine. He took a dizzy spell in the garden. Captain Ashworth was assisting him. If I ever hear so much as a whisper of another version of this story, you will not only be dismissed without a reference, but I will personally see to it that your names are ruined in every great house in this country. You will never work again." He stared at them until they both bowed their heads in terrified submission. "Now get back to your duties." He was left alone with his son. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rustling the roses. "My study?" the Duke finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. In 10 minutes, he turned and strode back into the house without another word. Abernathy, the butler, was dispatched with 2 separate, chillingly polite messages, one to the Earl and Lady Caroline, and one to the Duchess, informing them that the Duke required their presence. It was not a request. The stage was now set. The doors of the study would close, and within that silent, wood-panelled room, a private trial would commence, a judgment of honour from which there would be no appeal. The air in the Duke's study was thick enough to choke on, smelling of old leather, expensive brandy, and cold, simmering rage. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, shutting out the world. It was a courtroom with only one judge, Duke Felix, who sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his face a mask of stone. Francis stood near the fireplace, his posture rigid, his knuckles still slightly bruised. The Duchess sat in a high-backed chair, her face pale, but her spine straight as a rod of iron. Across from them stood the Earl of Montford and his wife, Lady Caroline. The Earl was nursing his jaw, a pathetic, sullen look on his face. Lady Caroline simply stared at the floor, the picture of humiliation. "Montford," the Duke began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "you will explain the meaning of this disgrace. Now." The Earl scoffed, attempting a blustering defense. "The woman is a seductress. She threw herself at me, and when I rebuffed her, she cried foul. Francis, in his infatuation, simply took her side." Francis took a step forward, his voice cutting through the lie with military precision. "I heard you. I heard you threaten to ruin Mrs. Darnell if she did not submit to you. I heard you offer her your protection in exchange for her silence. You are a liar and a coward." The Duke's cold gaze shifted to the Earl, his expression one of utter contempt. He had his son's word, the word of a decorated officer and his heir, against the pathetic lies of a man who had just been knocked to the ground in his own garden. There was no contest. "You have brought a profound dishonor to this house, and to your own name," the Duke stated, his voice flat and final. It was a sentence being passed. "You and your family will be gone by dawn. You will tell the world it was a family emergency. I will put out the word that you are not to be received. You are finished in London. You are finished everywhere." Lady Caroline finally looked at her husband, her eyes filled with a quiet, bottomless shame. She then looked at the Duke. "We will be gone, Your Grace," she said, her voice a near whisper. She curtsied, turned, and walked out of the room without a backward glance at the man she had married. The Earl, after a moment of stunned silence, followed her, a disgraced and broken man. The door clicked shut, leaving only the three of them. The immediate crisis was over. Now, the real war began. The Duke fixed his icy gaze on his son. "The filth has been dealt with. Now we deal with the source of the infection." He rang a small silver bell on his desk. "You may think your actions were noble, Francis. They were reckless. You have brought scandal to my door, all for a woman who has no place here." Just then, Abernathy entered. "Mr. Harding is here, Your Grace." "Send him in," the Duke commanded. The solicitor entered, a thin, serious man holding a leather folio. The Duke gestured for him to stand before the desk. A grim, triumphant look entered the Duke's eyes. He believed he was holding his final, unbeatable weapon. "Francis," he said, his voice laced with cold satisfaction, "your delusion ends tonight. You cannot have this woman, not just because of her station, but because of the law. A man cannot take another man's wife." He turned to the solicitor. "Harding, report. You have confirmed, I trust, that the governess is the legal, wedded wife of Lord George Darnell of Norfolk?" The solicitor opened his report, his face impassive. "Your Grace, I did investigate the matter of Lord Darnell as you instructed. My inquiries led me to the local magistrate. Lord Darnell is no longer a concern." The Duke leaned forward. "Meaning? He is deceased, Your Grace," the solicitor stated, his voice dry and factual. "He died just over a month ago. A drunken carriage accident on the Norwich Road. His horse bolted, the carriage overturned. The death was ruled an accident. The news landed in the silent room. A stunning, world-altering revelation." Francis stared, his heart stopping in his chest. "She is free. the solicitor continued. Furthermore, my inquiries revealed Lord Darnell was a man of ruinous debts and a reputation for cruelty. It is the local opinion that Mrs. Darnell was forced to flee for her own safety. In the eyes of the law, Your Grace, the woman is a respectable widow of good character. There are no impediments. The Duke sat behind his desk, his face ashen, his expression one of utter shock. The weapon he had commissioned to destroy the relationship had, in a stunning twist of fate, become the very thing that legitimized it. His own investigation had just proven his son's choice to be a noble one. He was disarmed, defeated, his authority shattered by the truth he himself had unearthed. "Get out!" he finally rasped at the solicitor. Once the man was gone, he turned on Francis, his face a mask of fury and impotence. "This changes nothing! She is a nobody. I will never give my blessing. I will see you disinherited first!" He slammed his fist on the desk, his rage uncontrollable. He tried to rise from his chair, his face turning a dark, mottled red. A strangled gasp escaped his lips. His eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and pain. He clutched at his chest, his legs giving way beneath him, and collapsed to the floor with a heavy, sickening thud. "Father!" Francis cried, rushing forward as the Duchess screamed his name. A terrible, fragile silence descended upon Westvale Hall, broken only by the doctor's hushed orders and the ticking of the great hall clock. In the chaotic aftermath of the Earl's disgrace, Lady Caroline, in her profound shame, had left her sons, Arthur and James, in the permanent care of her sister before departing with her ruined husband. The Duke had suffered a severe apoplexy, a stroke brought on by his uncontrollable rage. He was alive, but the Titan of Westvale Hall was, in an instant, rendered an invalid, paralyzed on his left side, and unable to speak. In the first few days, Francis was consumed by a tidal wave of guilt, and the Duchess was lost in a fog of fear and grief. The household, leaderless, began to drift into chaos. It was Juliet who, having lived a life defined by crisis, quietly took command. It was she who organized the servants, liaised with the doctor, and ensured a calm, quiet order was maintained for the sake of the Duke's recovery. Her presence, once a source of conflict, became the household's anchor. She took it upon herself to sit with the Duke during the long afternoon hours when the Duchess was resting. The first time she entered his room, he glared at her with his one good eye, his trapped fury still potent. But Juliet was not intimidated. She did not see the Duke who had threatened her. She saw a frightened, broken man. She did not coddle him or fear him. She simply cared for him. She read to him from the newspaper, just as she did for the boys. She would bring Rosanna in, and the child, in her innocent bliss, would pat the Duke's unfeeling hand. Juliet would tell him of the boys' progress in their studies, her voice a calm, gentle melody in the oppressive silence of the sick room. For weeks, the Duke lay in his bed, his mind sharp but his body a prison. He had nothing to do but watch. He watched this woman, this nobody he had tried to cast out, move through his home with a grace and strength that shamed him. He saw her kindness to his wife, her patience with his nephews, her profound, simple goodness. He saw her selfless, gentle care for him, the man who had sought to destroy her, and he remembered the words of his own solicitor, a respectable widow of good character, forced to flee for her own safety. His pride, broken by his body's betrayal, finally gave way. He saw not the obstacle, but the woman his son had seen all along. He saw in her a strength that his own name and fortune could not buy. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Juliet was quietly reading a book of poetry by his bedside, he made a hoarse, guttural sound. It was the first sound he had made in a month. She looked up, her eyes wide. He slowly, agonizingly, lifted his good right hand and gestured for a piece of slate and chalk. She held it for him. His hand trembled violently, but he managed to scrawl 3 barely legible words. I-W-A-S. Wrong. He looked at her, his one good eye brimming with tears of surrender and regret. Juliet's own eyes filled. She did not say, "I forgive you." She simply placed her hand over his and gave a small, gentle squeeze. It was an act of grace that sealed the peace. Winter returned to Westvale Hall, not as a tyrant, but as a soft, cleansing blanket of white. The wedding was held in the small family chapel, the air filled with the scent of pine and winter roses. The guests were few, only the family, the boys, and a beaming Lady Caroline, who had returned alone to stand by her sister and witness the happiness that had grown from her own shame. The county, which had feasted on the scandal of the ball, was left to wonder at the private, sudden, and unbreakable union of the Duke's heir. Juliet walked down the aisle, not on the arm of a stranger, but on the arm of Duke Felix. He was frail, walking with a heavy cane, but his back was straight. When they reached the altar, he placed Juliet's hand firmly into his son's and gave Francis a look of profound, complete acceptance. Francis turned to her, his eyes blazing with the same holy fire she had seen in the nursery. He was no longer a man torn between duty and love. He was a man made whole. The Duchess, holding a giggling Rosanna in her arms, was weeping tears of pure joy. "With this ring I thee wed," Francis said, his voice clear and strong, echoing the vow he had made to her in secret. When the vicar finally said the words, "You may kiss your bride," Francis lifted her veil. He cupped her face in his hands, just as he had longed to do, and finally, for the first time, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but a kiss of homecoming, a sacred, binding promise kept against all odds, a lifetime of love and longing poured into a single, perfect moment. Later, they stood at the grand window of the ballroom, looking out at the snow-covered grounds, the same grounds where he had found her. She was no longer a shivering refugee, but the mistress of the house, his wife. "You stopped that night," she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Your carriage, in the snow. You changed everything." Francis wrapped his arms around her, holding her and the future she represented. He thought of the man he had been, a soldier lost in his father's shadow, searching for a purpose he couldn't name. "You changed everything, Juliet," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. "I thought I was saving you, but the truth is, you were saving me."
A world made of stone, a whisper of breath, a life lived alone. My child was my crime, my shame was my name. Then you in the darkness, a flicker of flame.
A scarlet-coated soldier who stopped on the road. You didn't just save me, you lightened the load.
Now I live in the shadow of your father's great hall, the respectable governess, afraid she will fall.
They call you a captain, and I am astray. I lower my eyes when you look my way. A glance in the library, a word in the gloom, a dangerous flower beginning to bloom.
They can threaten with ruin, they can threaten with shame. They can never unspeak the way you say my name. This love is a treason But you swore on my child you would honor my heart.
Listen to me, Juliet, from this moment till my last. Her breath is my breath, her safety my honor.
The vipers are smiling, the rivals draw near. Your eyes become distant, consumed by my fear. The ice in your voice, a new kind of cold. Forgetting the promise, the truth you once told.
He whispers his poison.
I'm trapped and undone. Have I fled one monster to be lost by this one?
But I see the fire,
The doubt in your gaze. You're watching the predator lost in his maze. You heard his dark words and the spell finally broke. The reckoning punch,
The last word he spoke.
only see me, Juliet. Forget the eyes around you. They threaten with ruin.
they threaten with shame. But here in the chapel, I'm taking your name. This love was a treason, a war in the dark. And you kept the high promise you swore on my heart. We are past all their walls of cold duty and stone. I am safe in your arms.
Your heart is my home.
And your heart,
Your heart is my home.
I swear this.
The snow is still falling, but I am not